In the vibrant world of Indigenous music, Kookatha Gunditjmara man Dave Arden stands almost on his own. Having been around and in and around music and some of the most sensational figures of Indigenous music over the last 50 years, his story is one that is deeply intertwined with Indigenous music and Indigenous rights. And we're fortunate enough to have him here to talk all about that and more now. Dave Arden, welcome.
Thank you, Daniel.
Let's start with a question that so many of us get asked when we meet each other and we try and break the ice. Who's your mob then?
My mob is my mother's side, Kokatha, on the west coast of South Australia, and my father's side is Gunditjmara, on the west coast of Victoria.
And how did your mother and father meet?
They met in Fitzroy. My mother was taken from Seduna, from Kokatha country, and on the back of a truck when she was a baby with her 7 siblings, and travelled a long way to Adelaide institutions in the homes. And she absconded, and then she come to Victoria. And the funniest thing there was the meeting place back in that times that a lot of our mob would meet in Fitzroy, and she come to Fitzroy, into the park there, and she met a young man. His name was Wally Amos Arden Sr. And that's when they first met and fell in love, yeah.
It was such a melting pot around that time, Fitzroy, Collingwood, Footscray to a lesser extent. You were born on Wurundjeri country in Carlton, at the Royal Women's Hospital, so many of our mob were, including my grandmother.
Yeah.
But you grew up in the Collingwood Commission flats.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up there as a young Gunditjmara boy?
Yeah, it was beautiful. You know, living there as a young fellow, and I lived there with my auntie mum. And in our culture, we address our elders, you know, which was my father's older sister, is not just as auntie, but as auntie mum. Mm-hmm. And we call them our mum. Same with our uncles, you know, our uncle fathers. So my brothers and my father's brothers and sisters, that's how we would acknowledge them within that case. But living in Collingwood, you know, was a beautiful moment for me and my brother Wally Arden Jr. And we lived there with our auntie mum, Frances Arden. And there it was, at the time I didn't know much about it, you know, but it was a multicultural community, and we just hanged around and looked after each other, and, you know, socialised with each other, and went to, you know, to these schools, you know, that was in the Commission Flat area, Collingwood Education. And later I went to, you know, I got in trouble, and they put me in a special school.
You say the flats were multicultural. What sort of multiculturalism do we have? What sort of nationalities?
Well, there was, you know, back in them days, there, you know, the Irish, Scottish, and back in them days it was the Italians and Greeks and Turkish that were, you know, and we bonded. Culturally, we bonded. We didn't know what it was happening, you know, back in them days, but we just culturally bonded within sometimes the bulliness and the racism that occurred, you know. So that's the way we connected, and we become good mates, good brothers and sisters,
Speaking of racism, you experienced horrific racism at Victoria Park. Primary in particular. You and your brother Wally, he was a couple of years younger than you, who you were a kind of a father figure to at the same time. Yeah. What kind of impact did experiencing that level of racism have on both of you?
Very traumatic within that sense, you know, and pretty much for me and for my brother was, he didn't really get that from him, but because I was going through it was emotional for him because we were tight, we were very close, and if I got upset, he would get upset, you know, and it's my little brother. And, it's just the things that happened. I used to go to the principal's door, and on there used to be glass windows, on the door, on them old doors.
Yes.
And I used to, every time there was a racial or bully incident would occur with me, I would go to his door and smash his door with my hand, and I still got the scars. You see them?
Yeah.
And I didn't realise what I was doing. And I did an interview, and Uncle Archie got interviewed, and he started telling this story, and I didn't even know he knew it.
Yeah.
You know, but because he grew up with my father, you know, the Charcoal Lane, you know, and they were cousins. And so I'd go to this principal, to the head of the clan, the chief, and I would smash his window. And what I didn't realise I was doing, I was asking him to sort this out.
Sort his mob out.
You need to sort this out, this racial bulliness out, you know. Yes, it was violent in my behalf, you know.
But you're lashing out. What other options do you feel you had?
In political terms, I didn't know, you know, as an 8-year-old, didn't know what I was doing, you know.
And you attribute a lot of that racism, of course, to the attitudes of the parents of the times.
Yeah. And that's what it was, you know.
Because do you believe that children can be innately racist, or they have to get it from somewhere else?
That's the thing I learned, you know, and the thing I notion, you know. People are not born bad. It's the way we teach, you know. You know, and that's why I love songwriting. Within that thing is, within songs, you know, no matter if it's First Nation Australian or First Nation, you know, international, the stories that we hear that make us feel love or sadness or happiness, that these things that affect us within our lives of that moment of time, you know, are the keys of teaching, eh?
Yeah.
You know? Yes, they were beautiful. And then it got this beautiful music behind it, which touches our heart to make us happy or cry, you know? And it's that teaching that we teach and instill into others that, you know, we've got to be careful how we do that, you know?
So by that age of 8, the music world had yet to come to you, or you had yet to go to it.
Come to me.
But you grew up proudly knowing your Gunditjmara roots.
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I thought I was just like everybody else.
So you didn't even sort of identify yourself as Koori, as we used to call ourselves more predominantly back in the day?
Yeah. No, I didn't know.
But but your classmates knew and singled you out?
No.
Just because of the colour of your skin?
Yeah. You know, we knew, you know, in my community, it was just a norm. You know, a normal thing. We would hang out, you know, and we'd go and see, Mum would go to her cousin sister's place and hang out with family, and then there would be a celebration, and we would hang out, and they would talk about the past and where they come from, down from the missions into the city, and you know, and they just hang out and talk. You know, that I never knew much about that. You know, that we were First Nations. That come later.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that's similar to my experience in terms of not being able to break down my own sort of identity through, you know, Yorta, Kunai, connections to Watch Bollock. There was none of that back in the day. But what there was this storytelling from the uncles and aunties. Yeah. And they didn't refer to themselves as First Nations people. They just spoke to each other and to their memories, for want of a better term.
Right.
And that's what clearly was happening with you as well.
Yeah, it was clearly happening with me. Yeah, which was beautiful, because a lot of them stories and information I remember now.
That's right.
Yeah,
and you know, one of the tragedies, the unfolding tragedies that's still happening today, is that a lot of mob don't get to that age where they can share those stories and sit around and have young fellas and sisters sit around and hear those stories, and that's kind of one of the greatest tragedies we're still encountering at the moment.
Yeah. That they're not getting to, you know, endure, you know, or, you know, have a beautifulness that the elders sit around and talk about, you know, their past and where they come from and who they are, you know?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It's core to our culture.
Sad.
Yeah. Okay, so when did your musical journey begin? It began in a very roundabout way. When was the first time you were inspired to pick up a guitar or want to join a band?
It was the moment that I went and seen my father and my uncle. And my uncle's name was Lawrence Roach. And they were sitting there one time, they picked up the guitar and they started playing Guitar Boogie. And I go, oh, well, this is great. Dad, Uncle, I never knew you played guitar, Dad. And that sort of influenced me. I said, I want to do this. I really love this. And at the same time, around my mum, she always would, when I was a baby, and I would get upset and cry, and how she would soothe me, is she would bring the gramophone out,
Right.
and she would put on Louis Armstrong,
Mm-hmm.
Nat King Cole, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Dean Martin. And I think that music was installed in me back then.
Yeah.
So then when I seen guitar play for my father and Uncle Lawrence, which is Uncle Archie's big brother, I sort of, okay, I like this. I like that. And Collingwood, in the commission flats was beautiful. And I was a young teenager, and I become a lout, a Collingwood lout. And from that point, I was getting into trouble, with burging and stealing, and not listening to my mother, and I end up getting locked up. And I went to, they call it Parkville now,
Yeah.
but back then it was called Baltara Tirana. And I went to Baltara, and I met this beautiful lady there who was a guitar teacher. And I had a lot of time on my hands, and she taught me how to play guitar. And the two songs I asked her to teach me how to play was Chris Offerson, Bobby McGee,
Great.
which was my father's brother, which was my mother's favourite song. And her favourite, is Love Done Me Wrong songs, is Patsy Cline, Your Cheating Heart.
Okay.
So I learnt them two songs.
Written by Willie Nelson, I found out the other day.
Written by Willie Nelson. My
Cheating Heart.
favourite. Both of them are my favourite.
So this is a rare instance where a kid gets locked up in juvenile detention and has a transformative moment that sets you on a totally different path.
Yeah.
It sets you on a musical path, a way to connect with your culture, with your elders, with your uncle, with your father.
Yeah.
Are you the exception to the rule?
Exception to the rule.
Is your story exceptional compared to what the usual experience is like for First Nations kids in particular locked up in juvenile detention?
No, still learning.
Yeah.
Still learning within that. I'm not trying to find my identity.
Yeah.
Within that sense. If that's
that's
great.
fine.
Yeah. Because I was still trying to find, because see, my mother and I even now at 55, I sort of go, stolen generation and is the stolen generation. But we never talk about the ripple effect.
Yes.
The children of the stolen generation, and how that trauma affects that child or them children from the mother of that stolen generation. And we hear a lot, and there's a whole big conversation of that. But within our things, there's never conversations of the children, the ripple effect, and we never get seen or heard within that. And so me and my brother's that, and me and my brothers and sisters are that, like so many of us,
It's that intergenerational trauma
Yeah.
that I think sort of mainstream Australia still doesn't quite have its head around in terms of understanding the effects, the ongoing effects of colonialism.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of research about the place that suggests that the life expectancy of the children of stolen generation survivors have poorer health outcomes, educational attainment, and life expectancy.
What was the cancelment? We had the same as well.
Yeah.
We never had no cancelment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the guitar and music became, I guess, a form of therapy.
Yeah. It became my cancelment. It became my healing. And, the people that we'll talk about that played a big part within that to help me, find my outcomes towards who I am and my directions and my pathways of that direction, played a big part in it.
So you went into Tirana, you came out of Tirana. Do you remember the first time you were able to play the guitar and sing a tune in front of some of your family and some of your friends? And what sort of reaction did you get?
Yeah, it was at Collingwood under the flats, a Collingwood community centre. And I asked my mother to come and sing with me. And I played guitar. And it was the first time me and her connected of showing where I'm going and what I'm doing, that I'm not doing what I got locked up for, that this is where I am now. And it made her pretty happy. And it was them two songs. She got up and sang. She was shaking, as I still do when I'm ready to perform. I'm very nervous,
Yep.
But once we get through that first line of the song, and then I connect straight into the song, or the performance, But it's the first time I ever heard her sing, and she could sing, and it was a beautiful, special moment in front of all your peers and all the community that you grew up with, and all these community people and workers and, youth workers and social workers. And
we'll get to some of, the highlights of your career later on, specific moments, but I would imagine that one there would rate right up near the top.
Yeah. It's very emotional. Try not to tear up.
No, it's good for the cameras if you do cry.
Yeah.
Makes good copy. So, but if you feel like crying, go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I remember seeing a documentary of Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson and Christmas Island. Do you notice as we get older, we cry more?
Yeah. Well, I've noticed that with some of the old people I know. They sort of cry at the drop of a hat. It's a beautiful thing.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
it is.
For many of us, there was an album that changed our relationship with music.
Yeah.
For you, that album was From My Eyes by the mighty No Fixed Address. What was it about that album and that band that lit up your world?
It created my identity. I found out who I was. That's where I started notioning who I am. No, I'm not allowed. Yes, I'm a commission flat kid, but I'm not allowed. And then that gave me a direction. A beautiful man by the name of Graham Drendel was my music teacher, and that's when I was in Collingwood education, and I always contested, and it became the activist in me. It started the activism in me that I would not tolerate straps from teachers. And so when that happened, I would rebel against it. And so from there, they didn't like it, and they sent me to a special school, they called it. It was called Collingwood Alternative, where I met Graham Drendel.
Right.
And
what did he
brought
teach you?
that album to me.
Right.
It's the first time this beautiful man, a non-First Nation, brought this incredible album to me. And there was a connection within that sense. I owe him a debt of gratitude towards having, the intelligence, the cultural intelligence to bring a First Nation kid that album to connect to my identity, that, actually I'm a First Nation Australian. Wow.
And that album would have been fresh at the time.
Yeah.
What were some of the themes and stories within the album that sort of resonated with you the most?
The biggest anthem was, We Have Survived. That was incredible. It just blew me right out. We have survived. And then I started, at 14 years of age, starting to understand who I am and what's the whole perspective of, who we are and where we are, and the political, I didn't know much about politics, and I still, a lot of time I play it by ear, which is a great musical term, play it by ear, but within that sense, I started understanding the injustice, against our people and against all people, within that sense of bullyism. And it comes back to Victoria Park, of the bulliness and the racism, and the things that, the big establishments, you know, and then, you know, while my family had to move from the mission areas of Lake Conda, you know, and my poor old dear old mother from, you know, Koonaba mission, you know, got taken from there and, you know.
And Koonaba was one of the more infamous missions in the country in terms of the way they treated kids. And
That's
she was
right.
able to escape.
You know, Coloured Stones come out with Koonaba Rock,
Yep.
you know, with that album, you know, and that's when I learned, that's where their names come from,
So from my eyes and No Fixed Address raised your awareness and started making you ask some questions.
Yeah.
What were some of the revelatory sort of moments around that time that you thought, wow, okay, I didn't know that, but I do now, and I'm going to do something about it? What were some of the moments or issues that it raised for you that set you on a path where your music was inseparable from your activism?
Yeah. Well, it aligned my thoughts, you know, within that sense, you know, of standing up for your rights, the injustice that society puts on it. And every time I said society, within society, it's not society's fault. And then I had to activistly, you know, debate with them and say, well, it is society because we're not making change. And at the end of the day, all these, you know, the policies and procedures are made by men or women, you know, and at the end of the day, it's humanity that can change, you know, the injustice of, you know, of the unfairness of human or life itself, you know. So that's what it threw me in deeply into that. And then learning as much as I can within the sense of how to play these songs, how to sing these songs, you know, independently, just by me, you know, with my school band, you know, which we called Mixed Relation, which I, you know,
Great name.
You know, loaned that off Bart Willoughby.
Yeah.
You know.
When did you first meet Uncle Archie Roach and Auntie Ruby Hunter?
I met them when I was a little boy, because they used to live in one of the flats just around the corner, and Uncle Lawrence and Auntie Alma Roach, you know, and Uncle Horse Roach, and they lived there around the corner from, you know, our mum Frances and me and Wal. Yeah.
And there would have been music playing all the time and people playing music all the time. Did you ever envisage as a young kid that you'd be sharing the stage with them and being such an integral part of their story?
Yeah, no, I didn't, because it was just family, like you said a moment ago. You know, our families just grew up and we always congregated with each other, you know, and I think it was part of that healing, you know, towards, you know, not being alone, you know, and then family when it's time for family and celebrations, you know, celebrating, you know, would always come together and just celebrate or just conversate, you know, within that sense, and talk about the old time, you know, and just conversate and talk about the new times, you know.
I think, you know, it can't be underestimated how groundbreaking Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby were in their songwriting and performing, to the extent where there wasn't an audience for a lot of First Nations music at the time, and Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby actually created the audience for that. You talked before about learning some of the songs from No Fixed Address and the technicalities around that. But what did Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby teach you about storytelling through music?
A whole lot. Just like Bart did. He taught me how to write them stories, you know, within the rock and roll, you know, pop way. What Uncle Archie taught me about gospel, you know. And when I refer, you know, the family used to always gather and that, they would always sit around and listen to Love Done Me Wrong songs, country western.
Yeah.
Which is so famous in our communities, you know, connectioning, you know.
It is. It's fascinating. I always wondered why our mob really leant towards country music and not so much the blues, which also has you know a lot of that hardship sort of storyline to it. But I remember, you know, hot summer nights sitting around listening to Patsy Cline, but Charlie Pride,
Uncle Charlie,
Uncle Charlie Pride in particular. And so it was, you know, Uncle Archie's bent to lean towards that side of things to describe in vivid detail the lament that he had suffered growing up and continued to suffer. And that gave you more depth to your storytelling?
Yeah, and that's where what you just said is that depth within the songwriting of deliverance, and that's where, I started learning as much as I can within that, to craft myself before I got to the next stage of being a front band of my band, But within that, I learned as much as I can. And because I played a lot of music, we would always watch each other, I used to play in a band called Hard Times, and I was the drummer for them. And every time we played, Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby would, we would be their backup band, at the cabarets. And the cabarets that we did was the funeral fund cabarets, which were made up by Auntie Sissy Smith McInnes and Auntie Edna Brown. They were two great elders, because then there was the moments of pauper graves. A lot of our people got buried in pauper graves, and they had enough of it, towards raising money so we can bury our mob, respectfully. So we learned our trade there. See, not too many people know about that.
Yeah.
That myself and so many others, Kutcha and Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby, we learned our trade. That was our stomping ground.
But you're learning your trade as part of the community to better the community, to look after the dead. I often think that if we're in the process of erecting statues about the place, then Auntie Edna Brown surely must be a person that's responsible.
Her Auntie Sissy, it was them two elders that fought it. I could go into them places. It cost you money to go in because you're raising money.
Yeah.
Every time I walked to the door, they said, "Nephew, get going in there, go and play some music."
Yeah.
And it was and they were honing my craft, helping me hone my craft,
Honing your craft, but also honing you as a human being.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about one of your first musical ventures, the Koori Youth Band, which you once described as Victoria famous, but famous nonetheless.
Yeah.
You were the band's front man.
Yeah.
How did that band come about?
We went and did a journey up to the Handing of Uluru. And at that time, we were in Fitzroy. So, my father and Uncle Archie and all them, they were up the top end of the park, and we were down the bottom end of the park.
So this is the handing back of Uluru to the traditional owners back in 85.
Yeah, back in 85. Yeah. And we were at a FCYC, which is called Fitzroy Community Youth Centre, and I was there with a whole lot of our mob and street kids, and it was a dear friend there. His name was Greg Collin, who was the youth worker, and a beautiful lady, Jenny Clare, and she's an English lady that come over and lived moved to Australia, and they were the two youth workers, and we come along, and I talked to them about, and we were there, so we did the travel. They were just about, and they asked us if we all want to go up, and my wife, Violet Arden, and maiden name's Hughes, and it was Greg, Violet, me, my brother Wally, Earl Mal, we took this young little fella, Robbie. He was a non-First Nation, and his mother and father let him come with us, and we babysitted him all the way up there. He's done a big man now, and Wally's wife, Lisa Jones, and we all travelled up there in his bus and went up to the Handing of Uluru, and then it was an incredible moment. It was a moment, that you saw on TV, but didn't experience it because we lived in Collingwood, Fitzroy, and life in Collingwood, Fitzroy was a norm. People just related to each other. But we stayed in Kokatha one night, and on our way, and we're about to go into the Kokatha hotel, and I'm about to walk in, and I got jolted and pushed back, and I said, "Oh, you can't walk in there. This is the white bar." And my brother's Gavin Wangani. He's my little brother. If you know Gavin, he's
I've heard of him.
He's fair skinned.
You got in.
And Wally's that. And when Wally heard that, he got really angry because we never experienced that, you know? Because living in Collingwood with that attitude, we experienced racism, but they're not like that. You
Well,
only
that
saw it on TV.
segregation. Yeah.
You only saw it on TV, you know? So to see it back in 85, still alive.
It's not long ago.
Yeah, it's not long ago, and it sort of freaked us. So Wally turned around and said, "Oh, look, we'll just go and get a slab and we'll go back to where we're camping and we'll keep moving," you know? And then we went up to there and handing back and seeing all the beautiful elders, seeing the beautiful, you know, this amazing rock, you know, which is all Uluru, seeing all these amazing. And then we travelled. We heard there's an event, a celebrational event in Alice Springs. So we all got in the bus and we journeyed all the way to Alice Springs. And at that time, my wife's father was a Caterpillar Dreaming Arrender man. And she didn't know she was Arrender because of Stolen Generation. And her grandmothers were there, and at that time we didn't know it, you know? It was later, that, you know, and by that time she passed away, the whole darling. So, but her family's still up there. So that's a sad thing within that story that is a big part of me and part of my kids, you know?
Yep.
You know, because they're many cultures, you know. They're Kokatha, Gunditjmara, but they're Yorta Yorta, Muddy Muddy, and Arrender.
Yep.
You know, and that's my... And now my grandkids are Cook Islander, all them and Cook Island, apart from the Irish, Scottish, you know, German, English, which is the Arden is German.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we went to Bazzo's farm, and now it was blown out. I'd seen old brothers, you know, and a fellow who I started music with, you know, after I got out of Baltar Chorana, was one of my mentors and best brothers, Sowan Burns, the legendary Goanna Lee guitarist. And we hanged around Bart back in the Countdown days, and then learning as much as we can from Bart. And then he went off with Coloured Stones, and I went off with Hard Times. And then when we got up to Alice Springs and Bazzo's farm, it was Goanna. Shane Howard was there. It was Coloured Stones, Rumpy Band. And we was just so, you know, it freaked us out, you know, to see all these famous, legendary bands. And then Bart come to me and he goes, I'm going to do some No Fix the Dress stuff. Do you want to play drums for me? And I stood up real quickly and said, yeah, oh, yes. You know, at 17 years of age, I'm going, yes, I want to do this. Yeah. And that was the start of my professional music, you know, in 1985.
Must have been an amazing moment for so many reasons. And we think about all those great bands, you know, back then that are still going around the place now. But in terms of the broader music industry, the broader music landscape, compared to the plethora of First Nations artists that are doing tremendous work about the place now, you guys were still kind of outliers within the music industry itself. Describe what it was like trying to earn a crust and break into the music industry and get some sort of semblance of a following and success compared to what it's like now.
Yeah. Well, I'd heard the stories and I'd seen, you know, the famous movie called Wrong Side of the Road between Us Mob and No Fix the Dress, and the things that they endured to try to, you know, get paid or do shows, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, and I just heard a story from Kutcha Edwards the other day. He would ring up and get shows, but as soon as he turned up, they seen he was a black fella, they cancelled him.
Yeah, they heard his voice, but they didn't see his face.
Yeah, heard his voice, but didn't see his face. You know, and they missed out, you know, of
Big
these
time.
legendary, you know, acts and artists, you know. And so, you know, for here, we always had the community to rely on, which was really good for us Koori Youth, you know. And it was there up in Bazzo Farm that we sat around and talked about, let's start a band. And that's where Koori Youth come into it, you know. You know, and on our way back, we would listen to Uncle Jimmy Chai and the Pigrams, Cuckles, from Chasm, So we had all that stuff, to go the next step with what we were doing as Koori Youth,
It's kind of like, it sounds like you're kind of on a leaky boat together, sailing the oceans and the airwaves to try and make something of it all.
Yeah.
Looking back on those times, I was very fortunate to interview Bart Willoughby about a month ago, and I asked him about some of the close scrapes he'd been in whilst on the road. Can you recall sort of any close encounters where you thought, gee, we're lucky to get out of that one?
Yeah, quite a few. One I just mentioned before. One on on that journey where we went to Uluru, we had a flat tire. And two old fellas, Australian, and they wouldn't help us with our tire, and we were probably I think 500 miles out of we turned the corner where it's 5 or 3, I'm not quite sure, and to get to the Uluru, and then my brother went walking up there to seek help, and they give him a lift but wouldn't give us assistance, and he got, pretty much just a whole lot of that stuff, within that sense. But within us, there was moments, but a lot of times there was a great community within Collingwood Fitzroy, Like I said, we were great. Our community was multicultural, and beautiful people within that sense, that, didn't, have that way of, approaching each other, I mean, we hanged around, great bands, were called the Swinging Sidewalks, and they were legendary back, we were doing shows with them, Joe Guy and the Only Gammon Band, and Kia Carr, Jake, and Hard Times would come and play, and then, Black Lace would come down from Sydney and play Uncle Vic Sims, and, it was beautiful moments. And Mopping the Dropouts from Cairns would come,
Great names.
Brisbane Blacks, they come up with that famous song called Brisbane Blacks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've always seemed to me, from looking on from afar, that you've always been someone who's been looking to give back to your community, and you have, multiple times. So tell us about the Black Arm Band organisation where you were involved as a co-musical director. What was it that the Black Arm Band set out to do, and what was the idea behind it?
Well, it was set out to, give a platform, to next generations, but also our artists that weren't in the industry, the record company industries, and give them a stage to showcase their songlines, And that's what I really loved about it, and I wanted to be a part of it, I went there with Kutcha, actually, and Kutcha Edwards, he's my wife's brother.
Yep.
So he's my Jambi within that sense, and we
That's the Muddy Muddy connection with
that's the
kids.
Muddy, which is my wife's, she's Muddy. Yeah. And because they're mothers, sisters, see? And Jackie. So Kutcha, Violet and Jax. So that's how we're close within it. I was so lucky, my father's cousin brother is Lionel Rose. His grandmother and my grandfather were first cousin, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I was kind of very lucky, And people, I remember when we would say these names, people go, "Oh, stop dropping names, would you?" And I end up learning. I go, "Oh, okay, I got a little bit. Should I be doing that?" Or actually, no, that's my family.
Exactly. You go for it.
Yeah, I've got to go for it because that's who I am. I have to tell my kids who they are.
Yeah.
Because it's important that they know who they are. Within that way, they know how to be strong in their life and the achievements that they want to do in life. They just have to look at their, ancestors and realise that's who you are. You can achieve anything in life. You know what I mean? And that's what it did for me. Coming from Collingwood Fitzroy. Being trampled on a whole lot. And realising that I can achieve things. But within Black Arm Band, that's what it was.
Yeah.
It was an achievement. It was the first time everything that I learned within my music ability, everything that's in this, all the data that's in my, in my brain, you know, having the chance to, you know, do black armband, you know, and that's why they asked me to be a music director within it, you know.
So
You know?
what were some of the productions that Black Arm Band were a part of, and some of the artists that you were involved with in terms of helping them get a leg up within the
that's
industry?
a big, you know, the first ones, you know, is, you know, Emma Donovan, Dan Sultan, you know, Shelley Morris, you know, they were the next generation within that sense, you know, even you know, and you know, even the same for myself, you know, I was lucky, you know, and honoured, and I'm so privileged that, you know, within Uncle Archie's catalogue, songbook catalogue, albums, that I'm the only person that sang a song and has written a song on one of his albums. And that privilege and honour, you know, to this day, even morely to today, now we've lost the dear old uncle, you know. It's you know, I'm so, you know, proud, you know, of, you know, the emotions.
He's part of your legacy and you're part of his.
Yeah.
You're intertwined. There's no separating.
Yeah, which is so special. So, but still within the industry, I didn't have a record contract, or I didn't, you know, go to that next stage towards, you know, within them accolades, you know. But my accolades is my journey, you know, of what we're doing here today, you know, of that journey that I did, you know, within 45 years.
Well, you know, it always seemed to me that people like yourself and people like Uncle Kutcha should be household names. Seriously, I mean, you should have, you know, multiple arias and the like. And from what I can see today, the step for First Nations artists to get to that point where they have record deals, or don't even need record deals because they can distribute the music themselves so much easier. Do you ever feel sort of bitter about the opportunities that weren't afforded you?
Oh, no, I don't, you know, because I had the privilege and pleasure to be, took that journey with other people, you know, and that was pretty much after Koori Youth was that. You know, it was a privilege. It's, you know, in our culture, which we know is once the elder teaches you, you learn it.
You pay it forward.
And then you pay it forward. Yeah, you pass it down. And that's what I learned about our old traditional way of simulation, of when we did get simulated, that I have to re-simulate myself within that way of the way we did it. Of it's not about competing, it's not about profiting, it's about giving, you know, that I have to give that to the next generation. That's what we do. And, you know, I remember there was moments, you know, I think about 30 years ago that, you know, me and Shane always talk about, Shane Allen from Goanna. He says, when you go into the outback, you hear Bart Willoughby, you hear Selwyn Burns, and the influence that them two people had on our people, because when you hear their music, you know, our mob, you know, from the desert areas and that, you're hearing Bart Willoughby, the influence of Bart Willoughby, not the influence of Jimi Hendrix and B.B. King, or, you know, the Rolling Stones, or, you know,
original
Elvis
artists
Presley,
in their own
you
right.
know? Yeah, you're hearing the influence of First Nation artists within them, you know? And so with what we did, you know, because the early days of, you know, from 1990 to 1994 and to this day, the influence of what Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby and what we did, you know, just being a free piece, you know, trying to sell his block, when we were only making $500 a show, you know, and I'm leaving my family, you know, to do that. It wasn't about that. It was about that we had to do this thing to get this in people's consciousness, you know, get this in the industry, get this in society, you know, on, you know, telling, you know, our First National songline story, you know?
Yeah.
You know, and that's the incredible accolade. To sit back now and see what we did, that's, what more can I ask for, you know?
Well, the most amazing thing about your journey and the journey of, you know, Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby and so many others of your generation and generations before, is that our language was completely and utterly obliterated in a lot of instances.
Yeah.
But the songlines remain.
The songlines remain.
And you're part of that tradition.
Yeah.
And the artists today are part of that tradition.
Yeah.
And when you think about that as a concept, it's kind of mind blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. We're real healing ourselves, you know. We're real connecting from a cultural perspective, a cultural connection. That's what we're doing, you know. And to be a part of that is a beautiful thing, you know. I can be so proud, you know, of myself in front of my children, in front of my community, in front of the wider community of Australia or internationally, you know.
And it seems to me that now, because of the work that your generations and generations before did, there seems to be a wider, not a whiter, a wider audience for that than there ever has been before. People that are willing to listen to the stories and learn about the stories through song. It's a different landscape now in terms of the size of the stages that are being played and the size of the audiences that are being played to. You must be tremendously excited about your own future musically within that.
Yeah, very am. You know, because after, you know, taking all them journeys and crafting, you know, culturally crafting within the two worlds, you know, of learning as much as I can and how that at this point of time, you know, becoming a music director, becoming, you know, doing the MD stuff that I didn't even know I was doing, you know, of crafting that, you know, within the first 20 years, you know, then doing that and then becoming Black Arms music director, then becoming, you know, a music director for a whole lot of other projects and programs, you know, learning all that stuff, learning about songwriting, as we talked about at the start, it's more and more, you know, maturing myself within that sense, you know, and you know, where I'm at my crossroads now. Of delivering my songline, delivering the Kokatha Gunditjmara songman storyteller now, you know. So I'm so excited, you know, within that sense, you know.
In a way, it's like you're just starting.
Yeah, just starting on day one, you know. Yeah, it's taken 45 years, but it was that beautiful thing that even though simulation come, you know, and stolen generation and, you know, come and separated, we brought it back together. You know, so I was very lucky and honoured, and I was so lucky to have the elders there backing me.
Yeah.
You know?
Let's talk a little bit about your activism. And like so many other First Nations, Indigenous artists, their art, whether it's music, film, storytelling, writing, poetry, can't be separated from their activism in terms of trying to improve outcomes for their Bob, but also holding a mirror to society. Are they? Is your music and your activism the same thing?
Yeah, it's all one. It's all one. You know, I remember hearing the stories for, you know, when No Fix, you know, didn't get the, you know, the beautiful special moment that, you know, Yotha Indy and Uncle Archie got, you know, towards being acknowledged for what their activism is, their love story activism, you know, and within that sense, you know, towards the politicalness of what we do, you know, and back in poor No Fix's day, they were too political.
Yeah,
you know,
too confronting.
And then you go, you know, 20 to 25 years later, then we've got, you know, Treaty, Yotha India, and then we've got Took the Children Away, Archie Roach, and people, you know, their intelligence are going, yes, we do want to listen to this, we do want to understand this, we do want to acknowledge it, you know, and, you know, within that sense, our politicalness don't, you know, get confused that they are love songs.
Yeah.
What we're doing is their love song. And we talked about the Love Done Me Wrong songs. Relationship is political, you know, and that's what we don't understand. Yes, then we might specify something within that song that sort of turns you away or brings you closer to it, but that's the whole thing about writing, you know, storytelling, you know, of the writing, you know, because if we can do that and bring it, then you're taking acknowledgement to it, you know.
So all that storytelling kind of set the scene for the the broader public to take more of an interest in Indigenous affairs and the plight of Indigenous people. And then we reached a point, and it's a point that we've reached relatively recently, where there's an audience for people wanting to take a deeper dive, to go further into the story, to find out how we as a people survived from the outset of colonisation. And that's where the story of your great-great-grandfather, James Arden, comes in. And it led to one of your recent works, Mita, which means rise up.
Rise up,
Tell us about your great-great-grandfather, James. He was a traditional man.
He was a traditional
and he was a remarkable man, but tell us about that.
Yeah, James Arden. You know, he was the son of Barbara Winters. She was the traditional owner with her mob of Garryword, which some people may know it as the Grampians. And on Dunkirk, on Ararat, Ballarat, Ararat, Mortlake way.
Yeah, it's northwest side.
Yeah, so we were the traditional owners. We're the keepers. We were the
beautiful country.
Yeah, and caretakers is the right word. And we were the caretakers. So when other tribes would come to this ceremony and beautiful, they had to come through us. And so that's what I learned, you know. And from there, we were forcibly removed from there, the Ardens, to the concentration camps. They call them missions. And don't get me wrong, I'm not being negative within the way that there were beautiful places, these missions. Sometimes they weren't, you know. But there's a lot of family and positive memories within that, as well as the negative and sad memories of these places, you know. And they were forcibly moved and taken to them two countries, you know.
Yeah.
And within them two countries, the trials and tribulations that my grandfather were confronted with, it got that bad where, you know, he couldn't be just like any other Australian man, you know, as we know the story. And so what he did, he became the first activist in our clan, the Arden clan. And him and great uncle Billy King went down to Melbourne, down to here, and protested it to what was occurring and the things that were happening on Lake Conda.
What time period are we talking here?
It was back in the late 1800s that this occurred.
And how did that story come to you?
There was a journalist that was doing a book on the Australian Anzacs, and she did an article on James Arden, and she did all this research and then sent me all the research because I was trying to work out how to write this song, and I'm going, should I go and see Shane Howard? You know, and he was so busy, and then one day I just started penning it, you know, from the information and the research that I did between the stories that I heard of my auntie mums and the research of, you know, as much research as I could find, you know. Yeah, so they come down and did a corroboree down there, then two elders, and then, and it was written into one of the papers.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's James's gift to you here in 2022/2023.
Yeah.
That's a bit mind-bending as well.
Yeah. It's so special because the journey that I learnt from what, you know, my great-grandfather endured was a very hard. And his grandson is the first enlisted First Nation officer is Uncle Reg Saunders.
Reg Saunders.
He was an Arden. His mother was Mabel Arden, which was James's daughter.
He's also one of the most decorated First Nation soldiers to ever serve in theatre of war as well.
I met him when I was about 10 years of age.
He used to be on Kokatha.
Yeah.
Up in and around Fitzroy.
One of our,
There you go, name dropping again.
Yeah, name dropping again. Yeah.
We lost Arnie Ruby Hunter back in 2010 at the young age of 54. I remember the grief around the place when we lost her. And last year, of course, which seems so much longer ago than it is, we lost Uncle Archie, which basically closed a remarkable chapter in the Australian songbook. It's still way too early to tell, but what do you think their legacy will be, both in terms of First Nations music and the broader music scene in Australia? What will their legacy be in the years to come, do you think?
Very strong. It's, and especially for our people to that we can achieve anything, towards, culturally where we want to go, towards acknowledging where we come from and who we are, to, to make change in this country, and that's what
they did.
That's what they did, because I was a part of it, and and which I learnt morely, and always learning, to who I am and what I want to be, and but always sharing, the whole thing. I remember when we sat down, when it all started, we wanted to get to this place, and it's great to see the foundations, Uncle Archie and Hunter and Ruby foundations that are there now to help, to amplify that, towards giving opportunities to First Nation and non-First Nation people to come together and to sit at the table and to, to create things, which is going to be their legacy, which is their legacy,
I mean, you didn't have so much as a front row seat to their music, but you shared the stage with them.
Yeah.
What did you notice about the change in the audiences over time?
Oh,
I mean, was there a moment during that journey where you thought, "Hello, something's changed here in the way that this music's being accepted"?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of our first shows we did, after we did Charcoal Lane, we went out and did a show, and I went to, a moment I went into the men's toilets, and then I stood there and I can hear everybody conversating about it. And the conversation, it just blew me straight out. The positive conversations that we didn't understand it. We never heard it in that way of saying it. We knew about Aboriginal people. We heard all these policies, we heard all these concepts of how people address these things, but not in that way that Archie Roach delivered it,
Yeah.
And there was a prison officer which really connected me to this beautiful man. And he said, "I've heard all I can about Aboriginal people and this and that and this and that, and I always thought, I don't understand what they're talking about. But the way that Uncle Archie just said it tonight, I have an understanding of what it is about Aboriginal people when they talk about this injustice and this trials and tribulations of trauma." Yeah.
It's one thing reading about that injustice, but it's another thing having it presented to you in a way that you feel it yourself.
Yeah.
And that's
right.
That's a magic trick.
That's right. Within that intelligence, that your intelligence can understand.
Yeah.
And it's translation. I mean, that's what happened back in, the first moment of colonialism when it's translation. We didn't know how to talk to each other or understand each other, Don't go over there. It's a sacred site.
Yeah. What don't you understand about that?
Yeah. But it was translation because we couldn't speak the same language.
Yeah. Let's we could talk all day and we will still talk for a while yet. But let's try some word associations. So I'll read out some names and you just react to those names, right?
Yeah.
So first one, Uncle Archie.
Uncle Archie. My best mate. We always, could always talk to each other. There's things I didn't know about my father that he always taught me because I never grew up with my father. And he would always tell me stories about my father. My father's name, as I said before, is, Wallace Amos Arden, and his son's named after him, Amos, because the day he was born, Uncle Archie and my father were in the park, charged up and sleeping the day his child was born. And Dad didn't leave his sight. And then he got the call that Auntie Ruby's having a baby, and so he had to get up really quickly and go and be there with Auntie Ruby, you know, and because of that moment, you know, so there was a special bonding between me and him. First and foremost, he's my uncle father, you know, he's my uncle, you know, but we were like best mates.
Auntie Ruby.
Auntie Ruby is my auntie mum, you know. She's a Hunter, but she's also a Richards. My great-grandmother was a Richards. So I'm connected and never knew that. And I never knew why. And she always kept me around. Even when I left in 1994, I had a bit of a breakdown and I need to, because I've been doing it since I was 14.
Yep.
You know, by that time I'm 30, you know. And I left. And then I think 20 years later, we come back in 2007 and I joined back with him, our reunion. Black Arm was the reunion, but 2007 was the reunion of the three of us coming back together with Amos.
Yeah, it was big news, I remember.
Yeah, it was a beautiful, and she was there. I asked Uncle Arch, I said, can I come back in the band? He goes, don't ask me, ask Auntie Rube. And as soon as I went to Auntie Rube, see, Uncle Arch said, don't ask me. There was a button arm. And when I went to Auntie Rube, she said, what? Come on, get in there.
Bart Willoughby.
Big brother. When I got with him, I didn't know what was happening, you know, and as I said early on in the interview, what I endured and what I was going through, and you know, to find my identity and who I am, you know, to be this, you know, to be a beautiful, as my mother would say, be a gentleman.
Yeah.
And when I got with him and then found out, you know, 35 years later, we went up and seen my auntie mums, which were my grandfather's sisters, the Coleman sisters from, you know, Seduna, Kokatha. They told us who we were. And then I found out that we shared the same, and I didn't realise back then.
So what did you
that
share?
I was sent to him.
Yep.
Because I didn't know my mother, and I was sent to my mother's nephew, which was Bart Willoughby, and he's older brother than me, you know.
Yeah.
In age, you know, but I was sent to him for part of my Kookatha-ness, you know, of my cultural songline background, and that's special to me. And look. He's my mentor, he's my teacher. Everything I know is because of him and Selwyn Burns, you know, of the start of me, of everything, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but all of them, Uncle Arch, Auntie Ruby, so many of them people, yeah.
Titters.
Titters are my dear sisters, you know. I think it was their first album I played on. I played lead on that. They come and got me, and it was an honour. Sang... did many shows. Uncle Arch, it was the six of us. And then it became the nine of us, you know. But it started with the Titters, and then the nine of us, it was the Auntie Mill sisters. Mm-hmm. And it was the nine of us, and we would do all the folk festivals together back in the day.
Those harmonies, once you hear those harmonies for the first time, they never leave you.
Yeah. Well, you know, between them and the Goanna sisters, Rosie and Mars, I was studying them to learn how to sing, you know. You know, and that's where I am now, you know.
Uncle Kutcha Edwards.
My Jambi, my brother boy, you know. So Kutcha Edwards to me is, we're always, every time we're down, we ring each other.
Yeah.
And we cancel each other, you know. And I don't share that like I'm sharing it now.
Yep.
It's the words. And that's very special to me, you know, because, you know, it's, you know, that's my Jambi, you know. You know, we used to charge on together back in the day. And then now we always talked and I was there at his start of his music, you know, like I was there for a lot of people. And, you know, and we just haven't stopped, you know. But culturally, he's my, you know, he's my wise man within teaching me as much as he can about my wife's clan, so I can teach my kids who they are, because I know. And then also culturally, he's that brother, an elder, that you can always have a cultural conversation towards your law, you know?
He seems to me like, clearly, I don't know him as well as you do, of course, but he's someone that you can have the lightest conversation with, but also have the deepest conversation you'll ever have in your life with as well.
And we go into there. I mean, Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby was that for me.
Yeah.
And and then, sad and sorry for me. But I remember that. I remember that conversation. But having, Kutcha there, but we still got it, within that. I can have that cultural law conversation with him, all the time. Yeah.
Shane Howard.
Shane Howard, same. Same within that, he's, like I was saying before, he's my Irish Gunditjmara, man. He born for there, and, whether he lives on country or he's born on country, he's from Gunditjmara,
Yeah.
because he's devoted his life within Gunditjmara. And, look, Australia as well, nationally,
Yeah.
and islandly, but, yeah, a dear brother, the stuff that I learnt and that, I could always say him, I can ring him up and have a good old, cultural conversation with him between First Nation Australian and First Nation Island.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Paul Cully.
Paul, a beautiful man. I was there on the day that we sat down there and we looked on MTV and Took the Children was played.
Wow.
By him and the Messengers. Made us cry. Just blew me right out. And a big fan of his before then, and loved his stuff, and then got to meet him, me and my wife, with Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby, because he talks about the table, but he misses two people out of it. And it was me and Vi at that table when he talks about eating lamb roll sandwiches, and we were there, and to see that process. And Tim Finn,
Yep.
he come there, he was there, and, it was special and an honour to meet there. And then take the journey and plan, and I had the chance with him to take a song to him called, Freedom Call, Anzac song for the First Nation and Torres Strait Island,
Yep.
to tell a story. Yeah, and he sang and read a couple of words and sang.
Yeah, I was listening to it this morning.
Yeah.
Final one for word association. Australia.
Australia is a beautiful country, and so important to us within that sense, the cultural background that goes back even further than 60,000 years is important to us, What's so incredible now is the multicultural here, which is nothing's changing. It's the same thing. It's culture, And with having the multicultural here is so helping within it from the days that our ancestors, our parents, that had to endure the racism and the bigot and the bias and the bulliness that they endured towards where it is today in 2023. And the multiculturalism, yet we still got it there, them elements of negativism, but having multicultural people here from all walks of life is make an understanding of what First Nations endure and go through,
Yep.
within, and in trying to practice their cultural way, So for Australia being a multicultural country led by First Nations, and I have to say that, led by First Nations, is an incredible, as long as we go down that road, to make this country incredible, and not better than the rest of the other countries around the world. Hopefully we can set a precedent to show what we're doing in this country, because if we got to this point now of what we just talked about, the shaping of what us storytellers and the dancers and the paintings and the talkers and the activists and and the actors are doing, to shape that, in all cultural backgrounds, I think Australia's going to be incredible.
What do you want people to walk away with when they come and see a Dave Arden performance?
That they're soaked in the spirit of the Kokatha Gunditjmara songline story. And they take something from me and from my story and they see their self in them stories. And that's what I find a lot when people walk up to me after shows. They say, you remind me of my mum. You remind me of my dad. You remind me of my brothers and sisters. You remind me of a moment that I went through. And when that happens, that blows me out of the water.
That makes all the miles well worth it.
Yeah, I'm talking about my family, but they see themselves in the story of my family and community.
I said I was going to raise it earlier, so I'll raise it now. Of all the sort of musical performances and moments that you've had, we started off at the Collingwood Flats as probably the first major musical moment in your life. What are some of the other ones? I mean, we touched upon the handing back of Uluru to the traditional owners and your performance there in Alice Springs. What are some of the other major musical moments in your life that you'll take with you?
In 1989, I got in the back of a wagon and the car was full and in the back of the wagon is the wagon. And me and my daughter, my firstborn, Felicia Arden, and from Melbourne to Sydney all that night, me and her were sleeping in that. And we were heading towards Sydney to the building bridges. And it was the first time that Koori Youth, Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby, come together and created a band called Archie Roach and All Together. And we performed up there with my brother Wally Arden, Jimmy Reese, and Mary Fijian Cook Islander Tongan, beautiful man who was in Koori Youth with us, Selwyn Burns, Italian drummer John Frigizzi, and Rob Hornbuckle with Uncle Archie and Auntie Ruby. And we were up there singing Took the Children Away. I seen a video of it the other day by Gary Foley. Him and Peter Garrett created that, and so many others, but more Peter Garrett, Midnight Oil, and Gary Foley, and Uncle Brucey Mac McGuinness. And they created that. And we were up there on Bondi Pavilion playing that show. That's one moment I remember was a special moment with him, apart from the births of my children and my dear wife, that's a special moment that I'll never forget. Because three of them I've lost already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you lost your brother Wally just
my brother
recently.
Wally, who was the co-writer for So Young.
Yeah.
And Uncle Archie called him one of the finest writers in this world. Yeah. But he was still traumatised for the stolen generation connection that he never got over it. And he died too young.
Yeah, way too young. I saw I'll share with you, I watched the funeral online, because it's online. Very, very moving. He spoke beautifully about him, and he would have been very proud of the way you conducted yourself on his behalf.
It was a special moment, It's the first time, I never grew up with Gavin Wanganeen. I met him when he was 15 years of age. My brother, James Wanganeen, my sisters, and my mother. And to have them there at Wally's funeral was and I prayed for it.
Yeah.
That if there's anything that happens between my little brother, I hope they come. And they did. They didn't let dissimulation or the stolen generation policy not allow them, because we're family. It was a special moment for me. It's a sad moment, but for them to be there, and my brother Gavin to walk in that door it just blew me away,
I think it says a lot about you that you seem to look for the light in even the darkest moments.
Yeah.
And that definitely comes through in terms of your music and your creativity.
Yeah.
Like we said before, also, you're just starting out, really.
Yeah.
So what's next on the musical horizon
Well,
for you?
is to take metta, to everyone.
Great.
That's, I'm talking to my dearest friend, Jill Morgan, my wife, who's, my both beautiful sisters and my ministrational management, and so hopefully now the step is to take this story, everything that I've done between Black Arm, Uncle Archie, Fight for Survival, Hunter and Ruby, ready to take the Dave Arden, to do the Dave Arden thing, which is metta, and tell this beautiful story of the Kokatha Gunditjmara songlines, of Dave Arden.
Let's say there's a young Aboriginal kid in a commission flat somewhere right now, as we speak. Yeah. They might be wondering what they're going to do with their lives, do with their time, how they're going to get out of there. Maybe they've heard some beats that they like or a singer that they really admire. But where they are now, it's hard for them to see a way forward to become one of their own idols, to make their own music. What advice would you give that young person right now if they were here?
Listen to your elders. Listen to beautiful people, because that's what I had. Always keep, a positive outlook at things, even when it gets dark and hard, and you feel like you can't achieve it, know that the information, or people having a yarn with you, that you can achieve it, that you can go down that road, the things that you love and you like, there's nothing wrong with it, as long as you're honest and true to yourself, and like Mum said, be a gentleman.
Well, Dave Arden, it took you 45 years to get here, but you arrived just on time.
Thank you very much, brother.